The funeral. Michael Westbrook stood at the edge of the freshly dug grave, watching the polished mahogany casket being lowered into the earth, and felt nothing but an uncomfortable numbness spreading through his chest like frost creeping across a window pane. The November wind cut through his expensive black suit, but he barely noticed as his mind wandered to the penthouse where Chloe was probably getting ready and checking her makeup in that way she always did before important events. Olivia would have hated this weather, he thought absently, as the priest droned on about eternal rest and heavenly peace. But then again, Olivia had hated a lot of things in those final years, including him, most likely, though she never said it outright.
The will. The law office of Patterson and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower downtown, where Michael sat in a leather chair that cost more than most people earned in a month, but felt as uncomfortable as a bed of nails. Chloe had wanted to come, but he told her this was family business and watched her pout in that way that usually charmed him, but today only irritated his frayed nerves. Margaret sat across from him, radiating hostility like heat from a furnace, while her husband, Robert, kept a restraining hand on her arm as if she might lunge across the mahogany conference table at any moment. Olivia's brother Thomas was there too, looking older than his 55 years, with gray hair and deep lines etched into his face like canyons carved by rivers of grief. The lawyer, James Patterson, was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who shuffled papers with meticulous precision, while everyone waited in suffocating silence for him to begin. Michael expected this to be routine and straightforward because he and Olivia had discussed their estate planning years ago, when things between them were still civil, if not warm. She would leave her personal items to her family, he would inherit the bulk of their shared assets, and they would both make generous donations to the charities they supported. But as Patterson cleared his throat and began reading, Michael felt the first prickle of unease crawling up his spine like spider legs on bare skin. The house in Connecticut went to Margaret, along with all of Olivia's jewelry and personal belongings, which made sense since the sisters had always been close despite their differences. The vacation home in the Hamptons went to Thomas, who had spent countless summers there with his children back when family gatherings were still pleasant occasions. Then came the charitable donations, and Michael sat up straighter when he heard the amounts because they were far larger than anything they had ever discussed. $2 million to the Children's Hospital, where Olivia had volunteered every Tuesday for the past decade, reading stories to sick kids who adored her gentle presence. $1 million to the women's shelter she had championed after her college roommate escaped an abusive marriage and found refuge in such a place. Another $1 million split between various environmental organizations because Olivia had always loved nature and worried about the world they were leaving to future generations. Margaret was crying now, but they were satisfied tears, as if watching her sister's wishes fulfilled was healing some deep wound in her soul. Michael did the math quickly in his head and realized that these donations alone totaled $4 million, which was substantial, but not catastrophic to his wealth. Then Patterson paused and looked directly at him with an expression that might have been pity or possibly satisfaction at delivering bad news to someone universally disliked. The remaining liquid assets totaling approximately $12 million are to be placed in a trust administered by Thomas Brennan for the benefit of underprivileged youth pursuing education in the sciences. Michael felt his mouth go dry as the words sank in like stones dropping into still water and creating ripples that would eventually become waves. As for the marital home and all properties held jointly, these revert to the Brennan family trust established by Olivia's grandfather, as per the prenuptial agreement clause regarding infidelity. The room tilted slightly, and Michael gripped the arms of his chair, feeling sweat break out across his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. Margaret was smiling now, a fierce, triumphant expression that made her look more predatory than grieving, and he realized she had known all along what was coming. "You signed a prenuptial agreement," Michael Patterson continued, in that same measured tone that lawyers use when destroying someone's life with bureaucratic efficiency. "It clearly states that in the event of proven infidelity, all jointly held assets revert to the Brennan family, with the unfaithful party retaining only what they brought into the marriage." "But there was no proof," Michael stammered, finding his voice finally, though it sounded weak and desperate even to his own ears. Patterson slid a manila envelope across the table, and Michael opened it with trembling fingers that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. Inside were photographs, time-stamped and dated, showing him and Chloe at restaurants, hotels, and his downtown apartment that he thought was secret and secure. There were bank statements highlighting payments he had made to Chloe for her apartment, her car, her entire lifestyle funded by money he thought Olivia never tracked. There were private investigator reports detailing every meeting, every lie, every moment he thought he was being clever and careful and completely undetected. Olivia had known everything for at least 18 months, according to the documentation, and had methodically built a case against him while smiling at breakfast and asking about his day. The betrayal of it hit him harder than losing the money, because she had known and said nothing, had let him continue thinking he was in control. "But there's one more thing," Patterson said, and produced a cream-colored envelope with Michael's name written in Olivia's distinctive flowing script. "This letter is for you alone. Mrs. Westbrook requested that you read it in private, but that I inform you of its existence during this meeting." Michael took the letter, feeling its weight in his hands like it contained more than paper and ink, but something living and dangerous. The meeting concluded with Margaret and Thomas leaving without a word to him, as if he had already ceased to exist in their world. He sat alone in the conference room for 20 minutes, staring at the envelope, before finally tearing it open with shaking hands.
The letter sat in his car in the parking garage 3 levels underground, where the concrete walls seemed to press in from all sides like a tomb closing around him. The letter lay open on his lap, and he had read it 4 times already, but the words refused to make sense in any way that didn't shatter everything he thought he understood. "Dearest Michael," it began, and even her handwriting seemed to mock him with its elegant loops and careful precision, that spoke of hours of practice perfecting something meant to wound. "By the time you read this, I will be gone, and you will have discovered that I knew about Chloe, about all of it, long before my heart finally gave out under the strain. The doctors told me 18 months ago that my condition was serious, that stress could kill me faster than any disease, but I chose not to tell you. Why would I when you were already so busy with your young companion, building a life that didn't include the wife who had become an inconvenience?" Michael's hands crumpled the paper slightly before he forced himself to smooth it out and continue reading, even though each word felt like a knife sliding between his ribs. "I want you to know that I wasn't always planning to leave you with nothing, though the thought crossed my mind more times than I can count during those long, lonely nights. There were moments when I considered fighting for our marriage, when I thought maybe we could find our way back to who we were when we still believed in forever. But then I would see you check your phone with that secret smile or smell her perfume on your collar, and I realized you had already made your choice. She detailed how she had hired the private investigator, not out of spite, but out of necessity, because she needed to protect what her family had built over generations. The Brennan fortune had been carefully preserved and grown through 4 generations, and she refused to let it be squandered on a man who valued loyalty so little. Do you remember our wedding vows, Michael? When you promised to forsake all others, and I believed you meant it with every fiber of your being? I gave you 20 years of my life, stood by you when your first business failed, held your hand through your father's death, and never once wavered in my commitment. The letter continued with memories he had forgotten or chosen not to remember, times when Olivia had sacrificed her own dreams to support his ambitions. She had wanted to be a doctor, but put her education on hold when his startup needed capital and attention that came from networking at social events. She had suffered through 3 miscarriages alone while he was traveling for business, building an empire that he now realized was built partly on her broken dreams. I don't tell you this to make you feel guilty, though perhaps you should, because guilt implies conscience, and I'm not certain you possess one anymore. What I want you to understand is that every choice has consequences, and you chose Chloe over everything we built together, so now you get to live with that decision. Michael felt tears burning his eyes for the first time since Olivia died, and he wasn't sure if they were for her or for himself. The letter took a turn then, becoming less about recrimination and more about revelation in a way that made his stomach clench with fresh dread. There are things you don't know about me, Michael, things I kept hidden because I learned early in our marriage that you only loved the version of me that made you comfortable. I wasn't just a housewife playing at charity work while you built your fortune, though that's clearly what you thought during those rare moments you thought of me at all. The children's hospital where I volunteered was where I completed my medical degree quietly over 10 years, taking classes at night and on weekends while you never noticed. The women's shelter I supported was one I helped establish after realizing that emotional abuse takes many forms and that financial dependency is its own kind of prison. Michael sat back, stunned, because none of this matched the image he had carried of Olivia as someone content to exist in his shadow. I have my own accounts, my own investments, built carefully over the years from the inheritance my grandmother left me that never became part of our marital assets. I could have left you years ago, walked away financially secure and emotionally free, but I stayed because I made a vow and because I hoped you might remember the man you used to be. But hope is a dangerous thing, Michael, especially when it's placed in someone who mistakes kindness for weakness and loyalty for stupidity. The letter shifted again, and Michael felt his pulse quicken as he read the next paragraph that seemed to glow with malevolent purpose. I've left you something, Michael, not money or property, but information that you'll need in the coming weeks when everything you think you know proves to be illusion. Check the safe deposit box at First National Bank under both our names, and you'll find documents that explain why certain people have been so interested in your business dealings lately. I've also included information about Chloe that you might find illuminating, though I suspect you were too infatuated to ask the right questions about where she came from. She isn't who she claims to be, Michael, and her interest in you has nothing to do with love and everything to do with something much more calculated and cruel. The federal investigation into your company's offshore accounts started 6 months ago based on information provided by an anonymous source with intimate knowledge of your operations. I didn't provide that information, but I know who did and why, and that knowledge is my final gift to you, though you may not see it as such initially. Michael's heart was hammering now, and he could taste copper in his mouth, like he had bitten his tongue hard enough to draw blood. By now you're probably terrified and angry and feeling very sorry for yourself, but let me be clear that everything coming your way is entirely of your own making. You chose to betray me, to lie and cheat, and assume I was too stupid or too complacent to notice what was happening right under my nose. Now you get to experience what it feels like to have everything stripped away by someone you trusted, someone you underestimated, someone you never really knew at all. The letter ended with a final paragraph that Michael read 3 times, hoping he was misunderstanding, but knowing deep down that he wasn't. I loved you, Michael, truly and completely for many years, and that love deserved better than what you gave it in return. But I'm not cruel enough to destroy you completely, despite having every right and means to do exactly that if I chose. So consider this my final act of mercy, information given freely that might allow you to salvage something from the wreckage if you're smart enough and brave enough to face the truth. What you do with it is entirely up to you. But remember that every choice matters, and the ones you make now will define whether you're capable of redemption or destined for ruin. With more affection than you deserve, Olivia. Michael sat in the darkness of the parking garage holding the letter and feeling his carefully constructed world collapsing around him like a building imploding floor by floor. He needed to get to that safe deposit box immediately. But first, he needed to talk to Chloe, because suddenly everything about their relationship seemed suspicious and staged. His phone buzzed with a text from her asking when he would be home, and if he wanted her to order dinner from that Italian place he liked. He stared at the message, seeing it now through different eyes, and wondering what else he had missed while being blinded by attraction and ego. The game had changed entirely, and Michael was only beginning to realize he had never been the player, but rather the piece being moved across someone else's board.
The truth unveiled. Michael drove through the city streets with reckless abandon, running 2 red lights and nearly sideswiping a taxi while his mind raced faster than the engine beneath him. The bank would close in 40 minutes, and he needed to reach that safe deposit box before whatever storm Olivia had predicted came crashing down on his head. First National Bank stood like a fortress of glass and steel in the financial district, where Michael had conducted business for 15 years, thinking himself untouchable. He parked illegally and rushed inside, flashing his identification at the security guard who recognized him and waved him through without the usual tedious questions. The safe deposit room was in the basement, cool and quiet with rows of metal boxes lining the walls like silent witnesses to 1,000 secrets. The attendant, a young woman named Sarah, brought him the box with a sympathetic smile that suggested she had heard about Olivia and pitied him appropriately. He waited until she left before opening it with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped the key twice before managing to turn the lock. Inside were 3 folders, each labeled in Olivia's handwriting with titles that made his blood run cold, despite the climate-controlled air. The first folder was marked Federal Investigation and contained copies of documents he had never seen showing wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands. But these weren't his transactions, or at least he didn't think they were, until he recognized his own digital signature on authorization forms he never remembered signing. Someone had been moving money through his company, using his credentials and making it look like he was laundering profits through offshore shells. The amounts were staggering, nearly $20 million over 2 years, funneled through a network so complex that it would take forensic accountants months to untangle. There were emails, too, supposedly from him to various shell company representatives discussing strategies for hiding assets from tax authorities and federal regulators. Michael felt sick, because he had never written these emails, never authorized these transfers, and yet the evidence looked damning and absolutely convincing. The second folder was marked Chloe Bennett Investigation and contained a background report that shattered every illusion he had been clinging to desperately. Chloe Bennett wasn't her real name, according to the private investigator's report, which included photographs of her from 5 years ago when she looked entirely different. Her real name was Christine Morrison, and she had worked as an accountant for a firm that specialized in forensic analysis for federal prosecutors. She had resigned suddenly 18 months ago, right around the time she had engineered their first meeting at that charity gala where she had seemed so impressed by his success. The investigator had traced payments to her from an LLC registered in Delaware that was itself owned by a larger corporation with ties to the Justice Department. She was being paid to get close to him, to gain access to his computers, his files, his business operations, while making him believe it was all romance and desire. There were transcripts of phone calls she had made to her handler, discussing strategies for extracting information while keeping him emotionally dependent and distracted. Michael felt like he was falling through space, with nothing to grab onto, as reality shifted beneath him, revealing depths of deception he hadn't imagined possible. The third folder was the thickest, labeled Protection and Redemption, and it contained Olivia's detailed plan for saving him from the trap he had walked into blindly. She had known about the federal investigation for months, had realized that someone was setting him up, and had methodically gathered evidence of the real conspiracy. There were documents showing that his former business partner, David, had been the one creating the false transactions, using credentials he had obtained through a security breach. David had been embezzling from the company for years, but had gotten greedy and decided to frame Michael for money laundering while making himself look like an innocent victim. Olivia had hired her own forensic accountant, who had traced the real money trail, showing how David had manipulated systems and created false paper trails. There were affidavits from witnesses David had paid off to provide false testimony, and recordings of conversations where he discussed his plan with criminal associates. There was even evidence that David had recruited Chloe, or Christine, or whatever her name was, to distract Michael while the frame job was being constructed around him. But the most stunning revelation was that Olivia had been working with a federal prosecutor named Angela Chen, who was investigating David independently. Chen had agreed to give Michael immunity in exchange for cooperation once Olivia presented her evidence showing he was a victim rather than a perpetrator. The deal was contingent on Michael fully cooperating, providing testimony against David, and accepting responsibility for his negligence in allowing the breach to occur. At the bottom of the folder was a business card for Angela Chen, with a note in Olivia's handwriting that simply said, "Call her and tell the truth for once." Michael sat in the small room surrounded by evidence of betrayal on every side, but also evidence of a wife who had loved him enough to save him, despite everything. His phone buzzed again, multiple texts from Chloe asking where he was and why he wasn't answering and whether something was wrong. He looked at her messages, seeing them now as the manipulations they were, calculated to keep him engaged and off balance while his life was being systematically destroyed. A new text appeared from an unknown number, and when he opened it, his heart stopped because it was a photo of him entering the bank with a caption that chilled him. "We know what you found, Michael, and we know you're going to make a choice, so choose wisely because there are consequences either way for everyone you care about." Another photo appeared, showing his penthouse building where Chloe was presumably waiting, and the implied threat was clear enough to make him feel physically ill. But then another message came through, this one from a different number, and when he opened it, he saw a photo of David being led out of his office in handcuffs. "Angela Chen has already moved thanks to the evidence your wife provided, and you have 12 hours to decide whether you're part of the solution or part of the problem." Michael stood on shaking legs, gathering the folders and walking out of the bank into the fading afternoon light that seemed too bright and too harsh. His car had a parking ticket on the windshield, which would have infuriated him yesterday, but today seemed like the least of his concerns by several orders of magnitude. He sat behind the wheel and pulled out Angela Chen's business card, staring at it while trying to decide who he was and who he wanted to be. Chloe called, and he let it go to voicemail, unable to face her voice without knowing what he was going to say or do about the woman who had played him so completely. The next call was from a blocked number, and when he answered, a woman's voice said, "Mr. Westbrook, this is Angela Chen, and we need to talk immediately. Your wife saved your life, Michael, though you may not appreciate that yet. So the question is whether you're going to honor that gift or throw it away out of pride. Meet me at the federal building in 1 hour. Come alone and be prepared to tell me everything you know about David Harrison and his business operations." Michael agreed, ended the call, and sat staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror, seeing a stranger looking back at him with haunted, desperate eyes. He had thought he was the master of his universe, making bold moves and taking what he wanted, but Olivia had seen through him to the weak, frightened man beneath him. She had known he would betray her and had prepared for it, had protected him anyway because that was what love meant when it was real and not just convenient. Now he had to decide whether to become someone worthy of that love retroactively or whether to remain the selfish coward who had caused all this suffering.
Redemption's price. The federal building loomed above him, all concrete and glass, reflecting the dying light as Michael walked through security, feeling like a man approaching his own execution. Angela Chen met him in a conference room on the 8th floor,
a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, who radiated competence and barely concealed contempt. "Sit down, Mr. Westbrook," she said without preamble, gesturing to a chair across from her where folders lay spread like accusations waiting to be voiced. "Your wife was an extraordinary woman," she continued, "and you were too blind and selfish to see what you had until she orchestrated your salvation from beyond the grave." Michael wanted to defend himself, to explain that things had been complicated, but the words died in his throat because what defense could possibly suffice? Chen laid out the case against David with clinical precision, showing how he had been systematically looting the company while building an elaborate frame around Michael. "The money laundering charges would have destroyed you," Chen said, tapping a folder with one manicured nail, "sending you to federal prison for 20 years minimum. But Olivia brought me evidence that proved you were negligent and stupid, but not criminal, and offered me something better than your prosecution, David Harrison's entire operation." She explained that David had connections to organized crime that laundered money through dozens of legitimate businesses, including several that Michael had unwittingly partnered with. "Your testimony, along with the evidence Olivia gathered, will dismantle a network that's been operating for 15 years. So congratulations on being useful for once." The immunity deal was straightforward. Michael would testify, fully cooperate with ongoing investigations, and accept a massive fine for negligence in corporate oversight. He would lose his company, his reputation, and most of his remaining assets, but he would avoid prison and potentially rebuild something from the wreckage. "And Chloe?" Michael asked, though part of him already knew the answer and dreaded hearing it confirmed by someone who dealt only in hard facts. "Christine Morrison is facing charges for obstruction of justice and conspiracy," Chen said, with something that might have been satisfaction creeping into her professional demeanor. "She'll likely serve 3 to 5 years unless she cooperates fully against her handlers, in which case she might see 18 months in probation." Michael felt nothing for Chloe now, just a hollow space where his infatuation had been replaced by the bitter knowledge of how thoroughly he had been played. "Sign here," Chen said, sliding papers across the table, "and try to remember that your wife gave you something you didn't deserve, a second chance at being human." He signed mechanically, watching his careful signature commit him to a path of humiliation and honesty that his former self would have rejected with contempt. The meeting lasted 3 hours, covering every detail of his business operations until his head ached and his voice was hoarse from answering endless questions. When he finally emerged into the night air, he felt hollowed out, but strangely lighter, as if confession had burned away the rot that had been consuming him. His phone had 47 missed calls, and twice as many texts, mostly from business associates who had already heard about David's arrest and wanted answers. One message stood out, from Margaret, simply saying, "Olivia wanted me to give you this if you did the right thing," and included an address outside the city. Michael drove for an hour into the countryside, where fall leaves covered the ground like a carpet of fire, and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. The address was a small cottage by a lake where he had taken Olivia on their honeymoon 22 years ago, when they had still believed in forever. Inside, he found the cottage exactly as he remembered it, right down to the photographs on the mantel showing younger versions of themselves, smiling with unguarded joy. On the kitchen table was another letter in Olivia's handwriting, and he opened it with trembling hands, feeling her presence so strongly that he looked around expecting to see her. "Michael, if you're reading this, it means you chose honesty over self-preservation, and for that, I'm grateful. Because it means the man I married isn't completely lost. I bought this cottage 3 years ago and kept it secret, a place I would come when the loneliness of our marriage became too heavy to bear alone. I had planned to divorce you quietly and live here, working at the clinic I established in town, serving people who couldn't afford the care they desperately needed. But then my heart started failing and I realized I wanted something different. Not revenge, exactly,
but a chance for you to become someone worth the love I once gave freely. This cottage is yours now, free and clear, with enough money in an account I established to live modestly if you choose to leave behind the empire that consumed you. There's also a position waiting at the clinic if you want it. Nothing glamorous, just administrative work, helping people who need kindness more than they need wealth. You could stay here, Michael, and learn to be someone new, someone who understands that love isn't about possession, but about sacrifice and choosing another's well-being over your own. Or you can go back to the city, rebuild your fortune and forget everything that happened, but know that you'll be choosing the same path that led you here, broken and alone. The choice is yours, as it always was. But this time, you know the cost of choosing wrong. So choose carefully, because there won't be another rescue waiting. With hope for your future, Olivia. Michael stood in the cottage as darkness fell outside and felt something shift inside him, like tectonic plates finally settling after years of destructive grinding. He thought about Chloe and David and the empire he had built on sand, and realized that none of it had ever made him happy or whole. The next morning, he called his lawyer and instructed him to liquidate everything that remained after the fines and settlements were paid, using the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund in Olivia's name. He called the clinic and accepted the administrative position, explaining that he had no medical experience but was willing to learn whatever they needed him to know. He called Margaret and apologized, not with excuses but with simple acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, and didn't ask for forgiveness because he knew he hadn't earned it. 3 months later, Michael lived in the cottage and worked at the clinic, where he answered phones, scheduled appointments, and occasionally mopped floors when the janitor called in sick. He was alone, but not lonely, surrounded by the memory of a woman who loved him enough to save him, even when he didn't deserve salvation. Sometimes late at night, he would sit by the lake and talk to Olivia, telling her about his day and asking her questions that would never be answered except in the silence of his own conscience. He had lost everything he thought mattered, and in losing it, had found something he never knew he needed: the possibility of becoming someone worth being. It wasn't the dramatic ending he would have written for himself, no grand gestures or tearful reconciliations, just quiet days of service and slow, painful growth. But as winter settled over the lake and the first snow began to fall, Michael realized that Olivia had given him the greatest gift anyone could receive: not forgiveness, but the chance to earn it through action rather than words. And though she would never know whether he succeeded or failed, he worked each day to become the man she believed might still exist beneath the layers of selfishness and pride. In the end, that was all redemption ever was: choosing each day to be slightly better than you were the day before, until the accumulated choices became a different life entirely.